Mini-episode 1781 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.com.
The FDH Lounge. You want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge Mini Episode 1781. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris coming at you today, and we have with us here one of our favorite FDH Lounge dignitaries. He is here many times to talk baseball, sometimes to talk other subjects, but today it will be baseball, specifically a look back at the 2024 MLB season, some of the things that jumped out at us. We're going to take kind of a top-line look at the season here, just some of the things that jumped out at us at the postseason as well. The last time we recorded together was before the 2024 World Series. Steve Kallas, of course, you can catch him every week on his podcast, Kallas Remarks, with fellow FDH Lounge dignitary and great friend Joe Stazak. Additionally, Steve is the sports editor at the Westchester County Post, westchestercountypost.com. Steve, always great to have you on, my man, whether it's talking baseball or anything else. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be with you as always, Rick. Looking forward to it.
Should be tremendous. I will say, I guess I'm just going to start, if we're looking at it kind of structurally here, you and I were talking about this. You and I both had the Dodgers winning the World Series over the Yankees. I think both of us said in 6 games. Turned out to be 5. The very epitome of what they call a gentleman's sweep when you look at that. And I think, if anything, it drove home more starkly something that you and I were talking about that I didn't hear in a lot of the analysis out there, to be honest with you, not to put ourselves over, but I guess I will, on the whole thing, that particularly when you look at lineup depth, the Yankees, to me, would have been underdogs against probably 5 of the 6 teams in the National League, maybe all 6 if they'd made it there. And I think it just kind of puts into stark relief right now the gap between the top teams in the National League and the American League. And I think, even my tribe, as much as I would love to say, oh, hey, look at the run they went on to make it to the American League Championship Series. I mean, honestly, would they have made it there if they had the Phillies standing in their way or the Padres or anyone like that? So it's one of those things where I think there's a gap right now between the American and the National Leagues that only seems to be growing at this point, and I guess we'll have to see if the offseason does anything to reverse that.
I think that's 100% correct. It's the Yankees were painted correctly as having a general easy way to get to the World Series this year. I actually thought the Guardians had a chance to beat them, and when I was watching Game 3, they had that incredible comeback, and I thought they could actually win the series, but they didn't, and it was a pretty easy, as everything's tough, obviously, to get to a World Series, but it was generally pretty easy for the Yankees to get there, where, of course, they kind of disappointed on a number of levels, and I'm sure, if nothing else, we'll have a postmortem for the 5th inning of the final game of the baseball season this year.
Well, that's right, and the kind of thing that really you couldn't afford, because to the Yankees it must have seemed like deja vu, because the way that the Tribe melted down at the end of that series, again, they had no margin of error for playing the Yankees, and the Yankees, as we saw, had no margin of error against the Dodgers.
That's right.
So, they go from potentially sending the series back to L.A. and maybe making them think about it, which, again, they certainly would have been, because although, again, this is a thing where, and I made the comparison prior to the season with the Dodgers bringing in Shohei Ohtani, that this is their Kevin Durant to the Warriors moment. For all of that, there would have been the memories of a lot of postseasons past, because basically until now, the Dodgers were sort of a carbon copy of, and I mean this as damning with faint praise, what the Atlanta Braves did in the 90s going into the early 2000s, one World Series to show for all of that in 2020. And I'm not somebody to go putting asterisks on it the way that some people did. I don't put asterisks on any of the titles that were won in sports in the COVID year. But, again, just the one championship alone, the Dodgers would have been thinking about it if it went to Game 6, and then, boy, oh boy, especially if it went to Game 7. But it never came to that because the Yankees did the same thing that the Tribe did, and handing it away when they had no margin of error whatsoever.
Well, no margin of error, correct, but also a 5-run lead.
True, yeah.
Which you're going to have a lot of problems to give up a 5-run lead, but
right.
Of course the Yankees did. It's kind of funny what you say about the Dodgers, because as you know, their prior World Series was the COVID World Series, as a lot of people like to see, and some people think it should have an asterisk next to it. I disagree with that. But I remember writing multiple columns in 2009 when the Yankees moved into the new Yankee Stadium. And I remember writing a long thing about my father who grew up in the 20s and 30s. When I was a kid, he took me to Yankee Stadium and said, pointed to right field, that's where Babe Ruth played. And first base, that's where Gehrig played. Center field, that's where DiMaggio played.
Yep.
On and on. Whitey Ford. And when my son was young, before 2009, I took him to Yankee Stadium a bunch of times, and I said, Babe Ruth played there, and DiMaggio and Mantle out there, and Lou Gehrig at first base. And then when they decided to change, I wrote some articles, please don't build a new stadium, please do what you can in the old Yankee Stadium, which probably financially, frankly, was not feasible. But as I wrote in my final column on this, I said, all I can say now is that when my son has kids, he's going to go to Yankee Stadium with his kids and say, kids, Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Mickey Mantle, Joe DiMaggio, yeah, all of them, they played across the street.
Yeah, basically. Well, and that's the thing.
And frankly, Rick, I also wrote at the time, this is going to be different. World Series, the old Yankee Stadium to me was hallowed ground. You can't just switch it across the street and say, this is hallowed ground because nobody played there. Now, I'll agree with you that the Yankees paid for a World Series in 2009.
Yeah.
T.C. Sabathia, a couple other guys.
Sure.
And I'm kind of against that. That's always the knock on the Yankees. But when you look at the Yankees now, they've won one in 24 years, and what are they? They're another good team that has a chance. They're nothing more and have been nothing more. And much as I love Aaron Judge, and maybe we'll get into the MVP races of the Shohei Ohtani 50-50 versus Aaron Judge seasons, Aaron Judge has been pretty much terrible. I don't think that's a bad word to describe him. Pretty much terrible in the postseason, and frankly, this was another one, culminating, I believe, with like a 4 for 18 in the World Series or whatever it was. And someone will come back and say, well, Ohtani was 2 for 19, but Ohtani was definitely hurt in the World Series, so I don't really think you can X him off because of that.
Yeah, I mean, he's playing with a separated shoulder after, I think, Game 2. I mean, if he's having to, hold his jersey to keep his shoulder in place as he's running the bases, that tells you all you need to know right there. And,
correct.
You look at it historically, and there have been a lot of, sluggers that have struggled in October, and it's always, I don't know that you hear it as much in recent years, but you tended to hear it more. You certainly heard it a lot in the 90s with the Braves and some of the pitching staffs then. And like, the pitchers take over when it comes to October. That's what we heard here in Cleveland with these killer lineups that struggle to get it done in the postseason. But you can't absolve Aaron Judge because all he had to do was look across the field at Freddie Freeman, who had one of the greatest World Series, maybe the greatest World Series that any player has ever had. So, yeah, so it is possible to be a big-time player and to get it done in October. We saw it being done in the same series. And yeah, when you go to look at this, when you look at, what the Yankees have had there, again, as we're recording this, we're going live to tape here on Tuesday, November 19th, and I don't think there's going to be much of a lag time before we get this up. But as of right now, the elephant in the room is that Juan Soto is unsigned and could be signed by the time that we get this up. I don't know if that will be the case or not, but that's the whole thing right here, too, is that he did for the Yankees what they were expecting, to at least get them to the World Series. He is one of the premier hitters of this generation. He is somebody who has drawn a lot of comparisons over the course of his career in terms of his hitting, his plate discipline, etc., to Ted Williams. And you go to look at that, if he leaves the Yankees, that's enough to bring them right back to the pack in an American League that, like I said, I think is pretty mediocre compared to the National League. I think it's very NBA Eastern Conference right now. And if he leaves, if he goes to, say, the Dodgers, the Mets, one of the teams there, it's just going to beef up the other side of the bracket. And again, maybe the most that you can hope for if you're an American League team the next couple of years, all things being equal, is that it basically turns into like a murder-suicide pact trying to get to the World Series. And then basically a lot of the best teams in baseball will tire each other out. You look at this before, granted, Texas a year ago, they were playing Arizona, which was another lower-seeded team. That was kind of a fluky World Series with those two teams in there. Houston had enough to beat a very good Phillies team the year before. So it's not like the National League has dominated this era, but the way it looked in this postseason, it looks like they might be on the verge of at least the next 3 or 4 years really having the upper hand, and we'll have to see if that plays out.
I think that's probably a fairly good prophecy. We'll see. You're right, but I think it kind of makes sense. And a player like Soto can even make the imbalance greater if he goes to the National League. I agree with that. And he's also a world champion, one of only a few that were on the Yankees, of course. And you know what? That counts for a lot. But as between NL and AL, I will take you way back, because my dad told me this story. In 1951, the shot heard round the world, the Dodgers and Giants back then played the best of 3 playoffs, not like today. And, of course, Bobby Thompson hit the home run. But, decades later, when my father was talking to me, back then when it was the Brooklyn Dodgers, the New York Giants, and the Yankees literally across the river, one of them was always in, I think it was like 10 or 12 years in a row or something. One of them was in the World Series. But he said, I never understood why it was such a big deal. The shot heard around the world. All it did was the winner of that series was going to lose to the Yankees. And, of course, history shows that time the Yankees had already won in 49-50. And not only did they win in 51, but they won in 52 and 53 to be, I believe, to this day, the only team to win 5 World Series in a row. So, and there was a deep imbalance then, but it was really the Yankees against anybody the National League wanted to put it up, with a couple of rare exceptions like your Cleveland Indians at the time in 1954, wasn't it? They lost.
Yeah.
I think they lost the Mays, but did they win in 48, I want to say?
Won in 48, yeah, lost in 54, notwithstanding 111 wins, one of the greatest pitching staffs ever in 1954, but the sweep against the Giants, of course, with the catch by Willie Mays setting the tone and going from there. So it's really one of these things where, as you say, history sort of speaks in echoes, and maybe we're at that point now with the way that it has gone. And you and I had talked about this also too, that the fact that the sun is somewhat kind of setting on the Astros here. And again, damning with a lot of praise this time around, I would say. They didn't make it to the American League Championship Series for the first time in 7 seasons. But again, that made it easier for the Yankees to get to the World Series, because the Houston has been their bugaboo the whole way, as we talked about going in. So you've got a Houston team that's kind of come back to the pack. They had to kind of struggle through the first half of the season just to make the playoffs in the first place. The Yankees, who seem like they're on the verge of losing Soto right now, because apparently the only thing Steinbrenner's sons have in common with him is the last name, because there's no way George would let the dollar signs get in the way of re-signing the guy. And apparently Steve Cohen has put it out there, he's willing to go $50 million above any other bid. So you have a situation there. Cleveland, look, they really surprised me this past year. They really, I didn't see it coming. A lot of people didn't see it coming. But it's the same old story. If ownership's not going to commit, then there's a real ceiling on where they're going to get to at this point. So you're looking at, really, when I look at the American League here, and we've been waiting for them to do something in the playoffs the last 2 years, and it hasn't happened. And I know that they're looking at having to retain some free agents. But now that the Baltimore Orioles are owned by deep-pocketed folks here, I think it's, I don't know if it's venture capitalists, a hedge fund, whatever it is, but deep pockets, unlike the cheap Angelos family previously, with the farm system they have that's been churning it up the guys here. There's a real opportunity for Baltimore, if they're aggressive, to grab this American League by the throat They were right there with the Yankees the whole way. They really didn't, pull away from them the way that I expected them to. So that's one of the stories of the season, is that Baltimore has not yet taken that next step. But looking ahead, I still can't shake the feeling that they're going to.
Well, I think you're right, but I was very disappointed in them in the playoffs. I know it's one of those two-game things, and you never know what's going to happen. And they did when the Yankees floundered, which they did. The Orioles floundered equally as poorly, and you're right, they could never get over the hump. But they're a young team. They're very talented. I think if Soto's gone, then I would say flat out they're better than the Yankees. They might be better than the Yankees with Soto if he ever came back to New York to the Yankees, which I think your analysis on him is right. It was just so funny to see him after the World Series, because he was clearly told by Boris, don't say, I want to be a Yankee. Don't say anything other than, we'll see who's interested in me, and I'll take into consideration every team that's interested in me. I found it to be awkward, not as a Yankee fan, just as this is what you have to say. Whatever the truth is almost irrelevant. I'm not saying that's not the truth. I know that's Boris's truth.
Yeah.
Don't give anybody any leg up remotely and have them all come in and outbid each other. And if you get two, that'll be more than enough. Maybe the Mets in and of themselves will be enough. We've seen some owners in the past, negotiate against themselves and sign people for stupid money, most of which don't, work out. You know the history now of 10-year contracts. It's terrible.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I mean, in the back end of this deal, we're hearing like 15 years, $660 million. I mean, the back end of it is going to age like milk. Look at Pujols, look at Cabrera, look at a couple of these guys, but that's not what they're looking at. And that's the thing where, again, it all kind of depends on what you get for it. Now, neither of them ended up getting what they were hoping for in the whole shebang here. The Tigers got one pennant. The Angels didn't even sniff that with Pujols. So, again, but if you're on one, but those were both teams that had some work to do to even become contenders. And if you're going to a ready-made contender, if it's the Mets or the Dodgers giving this kind of money to Juan Soto, then there is very real reason to think that man's going to get at least 2 more rings by the time his career's done, and that might be a conservative estimate. But you look at the National League East, for example. If Juan Soto ends up with the Mets, with what we just said about the American League, you've got the Mets, the Phillies, and the Braves, any of whom I think right now would probably shape up as being the class of the American League, and that's before Juan Soto potentially goes to the Mets.
That might very well be true. Hard to argue with.
Yeah. Just the way that's going, in the Central, certainly you had Milwaukee. What a statement that was. A lot of people really thought they were going to be left for dead after losing Craig Counsell, but just, again, staying at the top of that division and in fairly convincing fashion. I was saying before the season, and I think I was only a year early on talking about this, you look at the Reds, and again, a lot of the young players there, and De La Cruz, and the excitement that's around them. The fact that they now have Terry Francona coming over there in 2025, he thinks that's where they stop underachieving and really kind of start putting it together. But again, Milwaukee asserting themselves this past year as the class of the division was very, very impressive because, again, it's not a particularly deep division or anything like that, but it just seemed like their moment had come and gone. And they basically said, we're not dead yet, and they proved it.
No, that's totally right. I just thought the Mets were kind of, if you watch them throughout the end of the season where, they had the best record since July 1 or whatever it was, it really did seem to be a team of destiny. They had some incredible wins with some, just shake your head home runs, Alonso, Lindor, and I remember Joe Staszak telling me before they played a game against the Phillies, they said, we don't want to play the Phillies. We don't want to play the Mets. They have our number, and, sure enough, that's what happened. But at the end of the day, the Dodgers had an incredible lineup. They're so deep, their lineup. Their pitching, they had a ton of injuries. You can laugh at me, but I think it was almost a plus that Clayton Kershaw couldn't pitch in the playoffs, because you know what I think of Clayton Kershaw when he pitches in the playoffs. And I think that was a blessing in disguise. And the guy who did come back and really saved them twice, I thought, in the World Series, was Walker Buehler.
Yeah.
I mean, he's coming off whatever, I don't think it was Tommy John he had, but it was some kind of ulnar surgery or something. And, to pitch game 3 the way he did in the World Series, and then come back. I know people say, oh, that's your throw day. I said, well, there's one thing between something being your throw day and another for you coming in the 9th inning of a World Series game to clinch the World Series.
Yes.
So don't just kind of poo-poo it, because these guys, if they last, 6 innings nowadays, oh, he's coming out for the 6th. What a guy.
Right.
But Buehler did that for 5 scoreless, I think, in game 3. And on 1 day's rest, I'm not comparing him to Christy Mathewson, winning 3 games on 2 days rest or something in 19 or whatever. But for him to do that and the way he did it, striking out 2 of the 3 guys he faced in the 9th inning of game 5 to win the World Series, and going 5 scoreless in game 3. I mean, I thought the Dodgers starting pitching for the, I don't know how much depth we're going to get into the World Series, but certainly the Dodgers starting pitching in the first 3 games where, it was viewed that the Yankees' edge was in starting pitching, but I didn't think that. But once, Flaherty, Yamamoto, and Buehler in the first 3 starts in the World Series, all of which were wins, as you know, they went 16 2/3 innings, allowing 3 earned runs and 8 hits.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is what, Freddie Freeman, well-deserved MVP and star with a big home run, certainly in the first 2 games were massive home runs. But those 3 starters giving that kind, because then, they went game 4. Was game 4 game 4 was the bullpen game, I believe.
Yes.
And so I thought it was those starting pitchers getting them over a hump enough where they could actually at least think they had a chance in game 4. They wound up getting smacked around, of course. But then you had other people coming back fresh. And even though Flaherty got knocked out after, I think it was 4 outs in game 5, they came back and Buehler came out of the pen along with other guys. I mean, they really needed their bullpen that game as well. But I thought the starting pitchers for the Giants were, I don't know if disrespected is the word. I know everybody uses that word, but I would say underrated. And the way they came out and pretty much outpitched the Yankee pitchers, that's what led to them, I thought, winning the World Series. Certainly getting a 3-0 lead with, of course, Freddie Freeman's big help.
Well, and another thing here, too, and I'm going to risk being obnoxious and pat us on the back for our pre-analysis here in the World Series. And you and I talked about this coming in, that the Yankees, they're starting pitching through the course of the season, and particularly when you factor in them being down Garrett Cole a good period of time. And then when he was back, he wasn't exactly Garrett Cole. So
exactly.
They outperformed what you would have expected from that staff. If you would have said, he's not going to be here to carry you at a Cy Young pace the whole year. Plus, again, carry you is a relative term, right? How much can one pitcher do out of 5? That's 4 out of 5 games that he's not even in there. So they did a tremendous job overachieving, I think, at least what we expected of them. But you and I said coming into the series, Dodgers pitching higher ceiling, lower floor. Yankees had the higher floor but the lower ceiling. Because we said, if Walker Buehler or one of these guys pitches like, the name value of a Walker Buehler, what you expect out of a Walker Buehler in a normal healthy season, then what they have is better than what the Yankees have. And we were like, we don't know if you're going to get that or not, but if it happens, they have a higher ceiling. We were right.
Yep.
That's what it comes down to, is that the Dodgers, and if you look ahead, to next year, and again, they would be probably as close as we see to a prohibitive favorite in this day and age if they sign Soto in the offseason. But in terms of the fact that they're going to be a very, very strong favorite to defend next year, it's not merely the whole thing of like, oh, the Dodgers, look at all the star power, look at the payroll, whatever. This was not the most likely of years for the Dodgers to have won the World Series for the very reason that the starting pitching was not what we would have expected. They're going to have a Clayton Kershaw back next year, which, again, a lot of city miles on him, right? But you're going to have, at the very least, an entire season of him. My strong bet is that he's still going to be at least an above-average starter in the game. You're going to have Walker Buehler back, who, based on the flashes we saw of him, might be the Walker Buehler that we expect to see. And on it goes at this point here. So if the Dodgers have starting pitching on par with what we've come to expect of them over the last several years, then it's one of those things where, we said this about the Chiefs heading into this year. On paper, this was before the Rashee Rice injury and everything else like that. On paper, they look like a better team than the one that won the Super Bowl. It hasn't really played out that way. They've looked increasingly just like the team that, eked it to the Super Bowl. But the Dodgers could look, even without Soto, they could look on paper stronger going into next year than they were this year when they won it all.
Well, I think you're right. If I haven't heard them talk about Ohtani pitching, but I assume he's going to. But the other thing I'll say about Ohtani is I think he might, I don't know what he would think of this, but he was so good as a non-guy on the field. He didn't play on the field either. Maybe he played a little, I'm not sure, but towards the end he did. He might be a permanent DH.
Yeah, well, I think that's going to be the case. I think he's going to be in there an awful lot, but again, they paid for him to be a pitcher also. I mean, he's the rare, really the only, double weapon basically since Babe Ruth stopped going both ways here. So they're going to get what they paid for starting next year. And you're right, I didn't even think about that. Ohtani's going to be pitching next year, not just hitting. So you're going to have that. But that's what it's going to take to hold off some of the teams in the National League and even in their own division here, because you've got an Arizona team that's young and pesky and only getting better. The Padres with Jackson Merrill, who did not take Rookie of the Year away from Paul Skeens. That could have gone either way because both of them are phenomenal prospects. They're great rookies. I picked Jackson Merrill to be the World Series MVP when I made my picks prior to the playoffs, Padres over Astros in the World Series. So you're looking at a situation here where, the Dodgers are still clearly the best team on paper in the National League West. But, if they're making it as a wild card next year, I don't know that we'd even be shocked because the Padres are clearly a team that could have 100 win potential.
I totally agree with that. And I thought that, frankly, when the series was going down, you thought the Padres had a big chance to beat the Dodgers. And it would be just another Dodger flub, but that's not what happened.
Well, and there's another thing from this year, too. Let's talk about that for a second, because you and I were speculating about this heading into the playoffs, the entire nature of the disadvantage of having a bye, something that you don't have in other sports. It's unquestionably a thing where in the NFL you want to be the number one seed. You've got the extra time to rest up your players. That means an awful lot. But in baseball, rest turns to rust very quickly. And you looked at it the last couple of years. The Phillies, who came in as fairly decent underdogs against the Braves, both times taking the powerful Braves out of the playoffs. And we talked about that coming into this year. Is that trend going to continue? Now, in the American League, I think what it comes down to is that I'm just going to say I think the Yankees and the Tribe didn't have a whole lot in the way of legitimate competition there, particularly once the Astros went out. Once the Tigers upset the Astros and did Cleveland's dirty work for them, I will freely admit that. I think in the American League it kind of cleared it out for the Yankees and for the Tribe. In the National League, again, I was a little bit surprised because, again, I was slow to believe in the Mets, even despite everything they'd been on. By the way, this whole thing with Grimace, the second half of the season here, too, the power of social media and the ability to take something and make memes that everyone can kind of rally around. But yeah, ever since Grimace threw out the first pitch of the game, that was the before-after point of the season. I still had it being Phillies-Padres in the National League Championship Series. That would have been more on par with the last couple of years, I think. But again, this is a situation where when you look at it, the teams that were able to advance through, the Dodgers and the Yankees, at least for 1 year, it sort of put the lie to the disadvantage of having a first-round bye. And, we've only had this dynamic for a couple of years here. So this is the one time when the 1 seeds kind of pushed back against that, and the 2 seed, if you look at the Tribe also. We'll see if it carries into next year, but something that you and I suspected might be a strong trend was sort of disabused in these playoffs, and now we wait to see over the next couple of years which way it goes, or if it keeps being 50-50.
Well, I will say that, Rick, but also if the Mets did beat the Phillies and the Padres beaten the Dodgers, it would have been 50-50, and I think that means something. Just the fact to me that the Dodgers had to go 5 games, not that they were really, really superior to the Padres. They were better than the Padres, I thought. But I still think, and again, when I'm watching the Yankees and the Guardians, and I'm like, oh, I don't know, they had an incredible comeback in one game, and it looked like they were coming back in another. But I agree with you compared to last year, where it seemed to me they should seriously consider going back to one game this past season. And Manfred said, well, it's not a big sample yet, et cetera, et cetera. So this will lean in his favor. But we'll talk about it next year, I'm sure, because to me, it's still something to look at. I still believe the team that doesn't play is at a disadvantage, but it also might be a situation, and it might have been this way in the American League this year, that it was so lopsided it didn't matter.
Yeah, it may very well have been. It may have had something to do with the dynamic of the teams playing each other. The National League was maybe more of a true test, because like I said, I mean, you had, depending on how you look at it, either a 5 or a 6-team meat grinder. I'd say 6 teams. You know, just everybody that was in that playoff bracket was just, I think, would have been favored over the Yankees in the World Series. I'll say that. I think even like the Brewers would have been in terms of what they brought to bear. So I think that, again, we'll have to see how this plays out going into next year. And, again, in terms of, but you've always got a situation, too, where, you've seen it over the course of the last several years with the way that the young stars have come up and made their mark in many instances, even in the postseason. I thought, like I said, Jackson Merrill was going to be just the latest of them to do that. But Paul Skeens, one of the bigger rookie sensations at pitcher since Mark the Bird Fidrich, the late, great Mark Fidrich. So, but he's going to have more staying power, clearly, because he was a top-flight prospect all the way through the minors. He kind of didn't come from nowhere the way that Fidrich did, so a little easier to believe in what's possible there. Even if he's on a Pirates team that still kind of seems stuck in second gear, largely because of ownership and the unwillingness to spend, which as a Clevelander I can well sympathize with. But, just looking at as everything continues to go for next year, again, you're going to have, once again, very robust competition for the different awards in both leagues. I dare say in the American League, I don't know what the preseason odds were, but you probably could have made out very well if you had a bet down on Tarek Skubal to win the American League Cy Young Award. But much like Sandy Alcantara a couple of years ago for Miami, just an unbelievable progression during the season. And hopefully in the case of Skubal, it ends up lasting longer and doesn't have the injury that Alcantara did. But
not just the Cy Young Award, but the Triple Crown, which is a big deal. You know, people don't talk about the Triple Crown with the respect it deserves vis-a-vis the Triple Crown for hitters, which is the most incredible thing in the history of the world. So it just kind of slipped under the radar, but he was incredible.
Well, and I know you wanted to get into the awards here. I know that you had some thoughts on some of the different criteria that people were using on the awards and the way that it played out in both leagues.
Well, no, I mean, look, obviously the MVP awards are going to be easy to give out. The more interesting question that's kind of been posed in New York a lot is who had a better year, Aaron Judge or Shohei Ohtani? So automatically people go, 50-50 club. And now that's incredible. But on the overall scheme of things, the stolen base, to me, and I've always been a big believer in the stolen base, don't get me wrong, but to have you catapult somewhere where no one has ever gone before is an incredible accomplishment. Having said that, when you look at what Aaron Judge led the majors in, not just the American League, what he led the majors in, it's going to be kind of hard to say he did not have a better year than Ohtani. Led the majors in 58 homers, led the majors, not the American League, the majors with a 458 OBP, 701 slugging. So he had the highest OPS in the majors, 144 RBIs, the most RBIs anyone's had since 2008, 1.159 OPS, the highest in 20 years. 133 walks, the highest in the major leagues, 20 intentional walks, the highest in the major leagues. So he had some incredible numbers. And, he hit 322 and Bobby Witt hit 332. He could have won the Triple Crown. And I will say Ohtani could have won the Triple Crown as well because, Reyes, who wins batting titles, hit 314. Ohtani hit 310. They were talking he needed 4 more hits the whole year, 4 more hits to, win the Triple Crown. And I give him all the credit in the world because it's hard to become the DH. I think it's a very hard guy. Some guys can do it and some guys can't. So, I'm not a biased Yankee guy, although I am a Yankee fan. I would say that Aaron Judge, everybody in the American League said Aaron Judge had a better year this year than he did when he had 62 homers.
Right.
So that's pretty good. I thought he could hit 62 homers. He had a terrible March and April. I think he said 207 at the end of April.
Yeah.
With not a lot of home runs, and then he went crazy. But he did go into that slump at the end of the year where he didn't get a home run for like 12 games. I think he only needed 12 or 13 to hit 63 in September. But whatever. And don't forget, Judge played center field. He played pretty good center field, made some really nice catches. I don't think his long-term future should be in center. They should stick someone else in center and put him back in right. We'll see. That may change if Soto goes. He may not be playing center. But you got to give him a lot of credit for going out there on the field every day. That means something to me. I know they just Otani maybe couldn't throw from the outfield or whatever, but we'll see what he does next year. It'll be interesting, but I think it might be pitcher, DH, unless he insists, I want to play the field. Like he has insisted, I want to do both.
Yeah.
And obviously, you're right. He's been the greatest guy to do that since Babe Ruth.
Yeah, and my guess is he stays at DH because it's just overall less wear and tear, and it's not going to compromise his greatness on both sides of the ball if he doesn't play the field. In terms of Judge, let's not gloss over the one point that you said there. Playing center field past the age of 30, whilst being 6'7". I just can't. The mind fairly reels when you think about that, and that he's been agile enough to be able to pull that off. That's one of those things where certain, and this runs across sports, where height starts being a disadvantage when you're looking at doing different things here. I remember a couple of years ago, fellow FDH Lounge dignitary Russ Cohen, at the time doing a hockey prospects show on NHL radio on Sirius XM, listening to it in the car one weekend with my dad when we were on a road trip, and they were talking about a prospect goalie, and given the fact that this was probably about 10 years ago, clearly the guy didn't last as a goalie, or we would have heard from him by now. They were talking about that, and yeah, the one thing about him is he's 6'7", and that might be a little bit of a disadvantage. I'm like, how is this guy going to do the butterfly, for God's sake, right? How are you going to close the 5-hole when you're 6'7"? So
yeah, that's a good point.
I kind of think of that. When I see Aaron Judge in center field, I think of that.
Well, I will say this about Judge, because it did happen a lot, especially at the beginning of the year, and I think was one of the reasons he was hitting 207. At 6'7", 6'8", he gets a lot of low strikes called on him, and he had a lot of strikeouts early in the season where there just were clearly not strikes. And I think it became so badly that the Yankees were complaining and sending films to Major League Baseball because it happened so much. And, that 2 inches you're talking about is often the difference between the strikeout and the walk. And I think I hope I said he led the majors in walks as well.
Yeah.
So second. And I think he gets the raw end of the stick sometimes because he's just so big. And umpires, it'll be at the knees for 98% of the guys in the league, but not for a 6'8" guy. And I think it got a little better. Maybe the umps were warned. Who knows? You never know. But and I think that helped him have the season he had. But he was in trouble early on. And he avoided most of the time, not all the time, including in the playoffs. He did not avoid swinging at bad pitches that were down and away out of the zone.
Well, and this is one of these things where I look at this era of baseball, and my tendency is to say that Paul Goldschmidt walked so that Aaron Judge could run. Because, pre-Goldschmidt, right, most big guys were like Dave Kingman. A hole in the swing a mile long. I can't think over the course of the game too many really, really, really tall guys who had plate discipline. And that's where Paul Goldschmidt was just a revelation. Because he could, put the ball in there as well as anybody. He didn't have a hole in his swing. Particularly at his very best. I'm not talking about it like he's dead. He's still alive, but you know what I mean as far as that goes. When he was in his prime, like that version of him. And yes. So, I look at that, and it just goes to show in today's game you can't pigeonhole anybody one way or another. I will say this, and that with Judge having the plate discipline that he has, and his ability to hit for average. One of the surprises to me over the course of the last 2 years, I don't know if it's a surprise to you as well, but like when you look at batting average, and that was the whole thing with like outlawing, at least we would call it the radical shift. Let's put it that way, because you can still shift within your half of the field, but
totally right.
Outlawing the radical shift, I'm surprised because I thought it would boost batting averages across the board, and this is one where I'm not afraid to paint with a broad brush. It seems like the really skilled players are finding ways to put the ball in there, but it hasn't been a rising tide lifting all boats the way that I expected it had. You've still got a lot of starting players and a lot of players who are actually putting up otherwise very good statistics, power stats and otherwise, that are hitting still with low averages that seem sort of reminiscent of the previous era, and that kind of surprises me.
Well, I think if you look at it vis-a-vis not the last 20 years, but the last going back 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years, a ground ball up the middle was a base hit forever, except they did like the Ted Williams shift, and they never did it to anybody else. But the ground ball up the middle, you just, when you saw it go by the pitcher, and in the old days, you'll recall when we only got the camera from behind the catcher, because they were afraid that people would put a camera in center field, as I guess some cheating teams might have done, and know which pitch was coming where. But those ground balls up the middle for 60, 70 years were base hits always. Now, as you said, I think you said it right, it's almost like it's a semi-shift now, where you still really have a guy directly behind second base, or those 2 inches off that you have to be, but you also can't play in short right. I think you're right, but because of that, this was not a true super shift, and if it was, you would have seen what happened last year. So did it improve a little? Yes. Did it improve as much as maybe you or I thought it would? No. But again, that's because you can have a guy where the ground ball goes up the middle, and there's a good chance, if you're playing that kind of shift, that you're going to get it, because you have like a 6-8 foot radius up the middle, which again, for 80 or 100 years was a base hit.
Yeah, and that's where I'm just thinking that it's all the other things that aren't going to go away out of today's game that maybe put a little bit of a ceiling on how much more availability there's going to be in the field for balls to drop in there, because you've still got spray charts, so you've still got the super advanced scouting as far as the positioning, at least on your side of the field. You've got, in terms of the sports science and the nutrition that everybody's doing, I mean, even going back to the days of Ozzie Smith and Omar Vizquel, I mean, I'm not saying that these guys were eating ho-hos for breakfast or anything like that, but I think that the dietary advancements in today's game and things like that, the training advancements, I mean, it's certainly not like, Babe Ruth pounding 35 hot dogs and a pitcher of beer every day back in the day. So when you're looking at the things that haven't changed once the radical shift was taken away, that's what maybe makes me think it's going to be a little bit more durable. And I'm sure, again, they're going to want to continue to induce more contact in this game. And so that's where, again, if you're Manfred, I don't know where you go from there. Now, he's been, he has not been afraid to throw out well over 100 years' worth of tradition chasing various things here. So there could be some more things yet to come based on the fact that over the course of the last 2 years, like we said, the batting averages really haven't shot up. Again, the star players, they've had better batting averages, but again, it just hasn't maybe been as across the board as we thought it might be.
Yeah, and I just have 2 more things to say about the bigger picture about the whole season. I did want to mention Giancarlo Stanton, because talk about a bad contract, right? He's terrible during the regular season, but his postseason numbers, again, he got 4 hits in the league championship series, 4 hits, all homers, all big. He got the MVP, and deservedly so. But it's kind of the reverse, I hate to say it this way, because hopefully it'll change for Judge. I was looking up his numbers. He's like a 2-0 hitter in the playoffs for many playoffs now, and that's a problem. But Stanton is incredible in the postseason. I think he overtook, and I think it held, and I don't compare them because I compare World Series home runs as different than postseason home runs. But he went ahead briefly and might have still been ahead at the end of 1 home run in the postseason every 8 at-bats, and he was a little ahead of Babe Ruth. But, of course, Babe Ruth had 1 home run every 8 point whatever at-bats in the World Series, not in the postseason.
Yeah.
So, but I did want to mention Stanton when you talk about bad contracts. Having said that, when you look at his numbers in the playoffs, his numbers are world-class numbers. The other thing I finally wanted to say, and you may not want to end on this point, Rick, but I do, is the death of Pete Rose.
Yeah.
It was so incredible to hear how so many experts still don't know what happened with Pete Rose. And I've talked about this with you on this show maybe every year, I don't know, but on page 229 of the Kostya Kennedy book on Pete Rose, there is a footnote that says Bart Giamatti, who would die 9 days later, and which is what led to him being banned from getting into the Hall of Fame for the rest of his life.
Right.
Bart Giamatti, on that day, when they each had press conferences, he was asked by the baseball writers, is this going to affect in any way Pete Rose getting into the Hall of Fame? And Bart Giamatti, why nobody ever says this is beyond me, Bart Giamatti pointed to the baseball writers and says, this has nothing to do with him getting into the Hall of Fame. You, the writers, will decide that. And of course, they never got the chance to decide it, because 5 years after Bart Giamatti died, they had the meeting and they put in what I've called the Pete Rose rule, which is if you're on the ineligible list, you can't get into the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
In that book, around page 229, they tell you what a sham that was, and their only goal was to keep Pete Rose out of the Hall of Fame, because before that, ineligible players could get into the Hall of Fame. Shoeless Joe Jackson, another guy who's been screwed by that rule, actually got Hall of Fame votes after Kennesaw Mountain Landis died. Kennesaw Mountain Landis is the guy who kicked out all the White Sox guys, even though they were acquitted at trial, even though we know they were acquitted at trial, because somebody stole their signed confessions.
Right.
The good old days of the law, Rick.
Yeah.
But I do want to mention it's going to be very sad, I think. Will Pete Rose ever get into the Hall of Fame? I think eventually, maybe. But I think the people who vote on it, if there's a Veterans Committee at some point in the future, have to just look at that statement that Bart Giamatti himself made. So every guy, Fay Vincent was like his best friend, so he was protecting Bart Giamatti, and everything you see is, well, Bart said he had to reconfigure his life. Remember those famous words?
Right.
And everybody used that for the next 20, 30 years.
Right.
Well, the problem with that is it was reconfigure his life to get back into baseball as a manager, not to get into the Hall of Fame. He specifically talked about that, and I've never seen any of these investigative reporters. Dan Van Natta on ESPN, he's great. He did 90 minutes on Pete Rose. He never mentioned the footnote. He never mentioned what Giamatti said. Kind of hard to do, and because that's kind of hard to rebut if you went up to all of these commissioners and said, well, hold it now. Your guy, Bart Giamatti, your guy said, it doesn't matter for the Hall of Fame. It's up to you, the writers. So how did 6 commissioners, however many there's been, walk away from that? I'll never understand it. And if they put Pete Rose in now or in the next 5, 10, or 20 years, they would have Ron Santo'd him. Because poor Ron Santo, a borderline Hall of Famer to me, but you know the story, diabetes, lost both his legs, was still doing games, put him in, he dies, and what happens? They put him in 2 years later after he dies.
Well, this is one of these things, too. I mean, I could be accused of sounding bitter on this, but it feels almost sadistic when you do something like that, because these writers don't want to give people their flowers while they're still here. Because you look at, there are just countless examples over a period of time. The NFL waited till Gene Hickerson was in a wheelchair with dementia before they put him in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Similar to Mongo McMichael in the NFL. Look, that guy retired a long-ass time ago, but hey, let's wait till he's got ALS to put him in the Hall of Fame. I could go on and on and on. You've got, Buck O'Neil in baseball, where that was like super egregious, because even if you want to play the whole game like, whoa, the numbers are very opaque from the Negro Leagues, you already have a team builder thing that's in there, or a game builder thing here. That guy, undeniably, in the world of baseball and in terms of promoting the game of baseball, deserved to be in there, even if you want to put him in the ambassador wing as opposed to the on-field wing. That part was undeniable that he belonged in there in one capacity or another. So it just is unforgivable that we keep doing this. Same thing with Steve Sable should have been in the NFL Hall of Fame before he passed away. I mean, we could go on and on and on. They're like, these a-hole writers in the different sports, they just wait for guys to die. So, I mean, the whole thing with Pete Rose, I see both sides of the coin on this thing here, so I don't have a strong feeling either way. But I'm going to be really super offended if they put him in now, rather than when they could have done it when he was still alive. So, you've got that, and then we also can't talk about the year in baseball, and if we're going to talk about deaths, without the guy that I regard as being the greatest player of all time, because in terms of, we talk about it with Ohtani as far as being a two-way player in the unconventional sense of pitching and hitting. But if you look at it in the conventional sense for a hitter of hitting and defense, I don't think anybody was ever a greater all-around package than Willie Mays. So that is something where he's my vote for the number one player of all time, and he passed away this past year, and the game is lesser for not having him here. So just want to touch on that as well. But again,
you get no argument with me on Willie Mays. 660 missed time in the armed services, incredible. He always walked around saying the catch he made in the 54 World Series wasn't his best catch ever. And I always thought, and I think he said it was, that one where he jumps at Candlestick, he crashes and jumps over Bobby Bonds, not Barry Bonds, crashes into the wall and still makes the catch. Now, it was just a regular season game, so you could say it wasn't as big. But that 54 catch did, as you know, because the Indians were heavily favored, I think 111 wins that year, maybe. Right. That kind of turned the tide on the World Series and changed the whole tone because it was game one. And I agree with you, the greatest five-tool player for sure. And just another guy, if he knew that, stolen bases are 40-40. I always go back to Mickey Mantle when Canseco became, was he the first 40-40 guy or was it third? I think it was 40-40 Canseco. Yeah,
right.
I never forget Mantle, who was a humble guy. Then they asked him, why do you jog around after every home run with your head down? Are you looking down when you hit a home run? He goes, well, I just showed up the pitcher, and I don't want to show him up again.
Right.
Now you got guys trying to see who can do the best bat flip.
I agree.
Just stuff like that. So, I don't know. I think Mays is the greatest five-tool player. If I still had to pick the greatest baseball player of all time, it would be Babe Ruth because he is the best home run hitter by far. Aaron's the champ, but it took him 2,000 more at-bats to catch Babe Ruth. 2,000 more at-bats. Not knocking Aaron at all. Also one of the 5 or 6 greatest players of all time. But also a Hall of Fame pitcher. 29 and 2/3 scoreless innings consecutively when he was with the Red Sox. You look at his record, he's like 3-0, all complete games. One was in the World Series, one was a 14-inning win, 2-1. He pitched 14 innings. His ERA is like 0.8. I don't know, it's stupid numbers. And, he's Babe Ruth, so I still think he's the best, although it's hard to compare. Yeah. Obviously, May's a better athlete, and that counts for a lot. But what Ruth did, if you ever go look at his bat in the Hall of Fame, it's the most incredible thing I've ever seen. It's so big. But again, it's the old pitchers didn't throw that hard back then. So you could use that.
I believe all the extra games that Aaron played over Ruth, I believe that was widely noted in all of the hate mail that he was getting at the time of breaking the record in 1974.
Well, I wouldn't send him hate mail. He is the all-time home run leader.
Yes.
But the greatest home run hitter ever?
Yes.
To me, is Babe Ruth. Nobody, the steroids guy broke his record. I think Aaron Judge is the home run king now.
Well,
I really do.
Yes. Well, and of course, what separates your critique from the critiques that were arriving in the U.S. mail in 1974 is nowhere in there did you make note of the superior white man, Babe Ruth, the way that the folks doing the hate mail did back in the day.
That was disgusting. I mean, we've come a long way from there. It's the old, we still have a long way to go.
Yep.
But that really was disgusting. And again, the pressure that he was under, which he talked about later, was just unbelievable that you would get death threats for hitting home runs. So, and this was not a racial thing with Roger Maris, but remember Ford Frick is the guy who was Babe Ruth's ghostwriter, who was the guy who put the asterisks into and it wasn't an asterisk. Now everybody says, oh no, there was no asterisk, but what there was for a while, Rick, was most home runs hit 154 game season, Babe Ruth 60. Most home runs hit in a 62-game season, Roger Maris. That was directly because Ford Frick was Babe Ruth's friend and ghostwriter, but you can make a case for that. Ichiro wound up beating George Sisler's hit in the season. Sisler had 257 hits in a 154-game season forever, and then Ichiro, one of the greatest players ever in my view, got 262 hits, I think, one year. And I remember writing, well, hold it now, if George Sisler had 8 more games, you think he would have got 5 or 6 more hits? Yes!
Agreed.
So these things happen.
They do. But always a pleasure to get to break down the baseball landscape with you, Steve Kallas, and I believe that we'll be reuniting our panel, our traditional preseason panel with me, you, and fellow FDH Lounge dignitary Ken Detweiler for our annual Don Coster tribute, our late great broadcasting partner from the Sports Talk Network that Ken and I did baseball coverage with back in the day. We'll have that to look forward to in the spring, and perhaps we'll catch up at some point over the winter if the Hot Stove League ends up justifying it. I know I'll be speaking to you on other subjects between now and the spring, so always a pleasure, Steve Kallas. Thank you so much for being here, my friend.
Looking forward to it, Rick. Always a pleasure with you.
Really appreciate it, Steve. Thank you so much, and thank you, everybody, for checking out FDH Lounge, mini episode 1781.